Hello, I'd also like to thank you for allowing me into your homes for this 25th episode of Season 5 of Esoteric Science Roundtable, and a couple of very brief announcements quickly. I want to continue to remind folks that we do have shows archived at Google Video under Esoteric Science Roundtable. Also, typing my name, Corey Cordes, would suffice as well. Also, keeping in mind that there are archives for the Freeman Perspective as well as Jeff Contreras' Therefore I Am television show, and you should be able to find them linked at least somewhat together. And also want to remind folks about the metaphysical philosophical meeting that we here at Esoteric Science Roundtable and Jeff Contreras from Therefore I Am co-host each and every third Wednesday of the month. And this particular third Wednesday for December is the 19th. And hopefully, the weather will cooperate as well. We'll have to wait and see, but keeping our fingers crossed for that. We had some rough weather last month, and people still showed up, so, let's see what happens. But again, the third Wednesday is the 19th, 8 o'clock, Spider House. We usually meet in the back area where the screening area is, and encourage folks that are interested in our respective shows to come on out and break bread if they're so interested. Let's see here. Okay. Also, the Theosophical meetings I've been hosting are going to be on hold until I find a more appropriate venue. The Spider House has not been working out quite as much as I'd have liked mainly because of the lack of lighting. Lighting has really hindered me. But I want to begin by mentioning next week's show, because today's show is essentially going to be a build-up and laying up some groundwork about the lost continent Atlantis, and I will also speak about Lemuria as well, and give hopefully some thoughts for consideration, considering those two lost continents of old. Next week's show, I'm going to have a phone-in guest, the gentleman John Michael Greer. I was fortunate enough to meet at Jeff Contreras' Western Mystery Conference that was held in August here in Austin. And he was gracious enough to accept an invitation to discuss the book that he has put together on Atlantis. This is quite an amazing book. I've been reading it, trying to get some ideas, obviously, for next week's show, and also tie into this week as well. But this particular book, here we go, very nice here, and obviously the blue screen is giving a little bit of an issue there. But Ancient Legacy, Hidden Prophecy, John Michael Greer. And some may remember him doing the speech on the Bavarian Illuminati that Jeff features on occasion on the show. Anyway, so the Atlantis book, and the gentleman that wrote that is going to be coming on next week. So that should be very interesting. And his take on Atlantis, at least the myth of Atlantis and what took place during that age in relation to our current age, is very interesting. And I will touch on that somewhat as I get further into this week's show, laying the groundwork for Atlantis and the idea, again, of a lost continent. The idea of a lost continent is, how do you lose an entire continent, first of all? That's one interesting point of conjecture. And considering the time frame for both Lemuria in particular, considering it's the older of the two, and then to Atlantis, which allegedly met its final demise around, let's say, 10,500 years ago, 11,000 years ago, roughly, somewhere in that neighborhood, that the final cataclysm by water took the last remnant of Atlantis below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. And so we have myth, we have legend, and we have had some different takes on Atlantis. And ultimately, there can kind of be, if you want to look at it, and this is the way I've considered it from the different sources that I have available to me, and there seems to be a scholarly approach. And there is a scholarly approach to the idea of the continent of Atlantis, in particular from Lewis Spence, and he wrote a series of books, the one of which I have is The History of Atlantis, and it's a very, very intriguing book that, again, tries to tie together from a scientific perspective and build the case for the continent of Atlantis. Also, a former congressman from Minnesota named Ignatius Donnelly wrote a book that was published in 1882 that was called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And I will borrow a bit from that later in the show as well to give some, try to, again, build from that particular approach. And then there's a gentleman, David Hatcher Childress, that's written a number of books about lost civilizations and certainly has covered Atlantis, again, in a pretty scholarly fashion. And then this most recent book that was just published in October of this year, the John Michael Greer's book about Atlantis, again, building a scholarly approach and researching the sources that tend to lend to that kind of a consideration. Now, certainly the other aspects are factored into John Michael Greer's book, and that would be the myth aspect and the metaphysical considerations. From the myth, you have particularly what was recorded through Plato's writings in the Critias and the Timaeus, and that there are little fragments in which an ancient story is recounted in which an Egyptian priest heard an account of Atlantis, and this was passed along ultimately to Plato and was recorded in his writings, mostly considered by scholars and people that have considered these writings as more symbolic than factual. Now again, considering that these demises or these subsiding of land masses took place at least, again, roughly 11,000 years ago, it's difficult to have any real certainty about a lot of these things, and so there's still a lot of speculation and conjecture. We have difficulty just piecing together what took place 2,000 years ago, and not much agreement on what happened at that time in relation to certain events. And so if we go, much further back than that, when written language wasn't really even a factor, then there's going to be difficulty in recreating. But again, the myth from Plato, and certainly the flood myths. The flood myths are throughout. They're ubiquitous. Through all cultures. Every culture has a flood myth. Every single peoples has their variation or their take on the flood myth, and so the concept that there have been great cataclysms in the past has been pretty well recorded in myth, and in my estimation, myth is at least based on some grain of truth. There's always at least some kernel of that truth that's at the essence of any myth. And so the number of myths worldwide would suggest that the cataclysm was global in scope. And there is indication that there were previous cataclysms, previous great cataclysms in which the entire globe was affected, and there were great changes that took place. Another great argument is to whether or not there was a vast, slow, gradual build-up or change or shift in circumstances, or was this more of an instantaneous, like a pole shift where things just slip and slide over, and what was once on one location on the globe is now moved and is occupying an entirely different place on the planet. And so that's always been a point of consideration as well when factoring in any ideas of lost continents, submerged land, and then again the restructuring of the planet. And also another consideration is the size of the globe, how the globe may have shrunk and contracted from a larger, more expansive, place. And so again, things may have shifted as a result of this as well. And we don't have any real, for certain evidence as to that either, but there's definite evidence of various cataclysms and various changes throughout time that science has definitely been able to point to. And so again, the flood myths are throughout every single society throughout time, and we can gather them up and compile them, and that would make a series of books in and of itself, just that. And then we get more into some of the metaphysical considerations that build into some of the cycles and the energetic playings out that may have influenced and affected those peoples from these ancient times. And so, and I will delve more into these myths and flesh them out a bit more later in the show as well. But in particular, Helena Blavatsky, with what was written in both Isis Unveiled and then later in The Secret Doctrine in greater magnitude and in much more detail, catalogs a lot of these concepts and ideas based on Atlantis. And this comes from it's at least a seemingly scientific approach at looking at these concepts and ideas, and considering from some time back, the religious texts, and that again factors in because we have many religious texts that give some idea about the time frame throughout these great cycles that have taken place, and that there does seem to be indication through, again, religious texts and writings from the ancient past of knowledge of great cycles in which destruction would take place alternately between fire, water, fire, water. There are legends of destruction by earthquake as well. And there seems to be certainly this rising and subsiding of civilization throughout time, and has been cataloged. And as science and our ability to penetrate and use radar technology and things like this becomes more acute and more evolved, we find more and more artifacts and more evidence that indicates that there were vastly ancient societies that we find off the coast of India, for instance, off the coast of Cuba very recently as well. And then certainly the more classical one would be Bimini, and where Atlantis is believed by many to have met its final demise. But there exists a lot of evidence, but getting back to the Theosophical Society, which is started by Helena Blavatsky, and the secret doctrine and what was cataloged and considered in that great work, that demonstrates, again, some of the ideas of the religion, the super science that allegedly existed, and the energetic cycles playing out through the different groups that found their way through the Atlantean experience. And then also the concept that these different groups spread out and became great civilizations in themselves, in a later age, but they were essentially seed colonies or remnants of Atlantis, people that escaped the cataclysm, for instance, and that there were these migrations throughout time from Atlantis, and that also there's consideration that Atlantis had different colonies as well, and there is different evidence that helps to substantiate and support that, and I'll get into that more so as well. But again, a lot of what was built up into a lot of the, and even Tolkien, has a take on the Middle Earth and kind of a reworking of the Atlantis myth, as does C.W. Lewis in some of his writings. And this seems to be colored, it seems to be colored considerably by the theosophical slant on Atlantis and how that's been portrayed. Also, Edgar Cayce, The Sleeping Prophet, some may be familiar with the life readings in which unexpectedly thoughts and talk of Atlantis came up, and different information came forward through these different life readings in which past lives of people that actually lived during this time were reviewed, and then these were recounted via Cayce. And so a whole book has been written, Edgar Cayce on Atlantis, that threads together a lot of these life readings and helps to, again, weave some consideration as to what the existence may have been like at that time. I did a show a while back that I entitled Migration, and I spoke about some of these ideas in the context of the current wave of migration coming back into, in particular, America, but those that have found themselves in incarnation in the North American continent, Central America, South America, that there seems to be a revisitation of souls that had once had an experience, or many lifetimes for that matter, in Atlantis, and have very deep ties, karmic ties, and obligations to this place, and to fulfill certain things tied to, again, some of what allegedly took place. There are responsible parties because of the way in which we let our emotions and we let ourselves destroy ourselves ultimately, which is part of this, again, the myth that I'll delve into more so. But Edgar Cayce did weave a very fantastic tale, if you choose to believe that he was reliably able to retrieve, a snapshot of what was going on back then, and see how these people were, playing a role at that time, how their incarnations affected and played out at that time. And then there's another interesting book by John Mitchell, which is The View Over Atlantis. And he does not really get into Atlantis, really. The title's a little misleading, but it's a wonderful book that ties together the ideas of the ley lines, or the ley lines so-called, and it shows aerial diagrams, and it shows a lot of pictures that he contends or alleges that the concept from the sciences of Atlantis spread out, and that all these civilizations afterwards that used this sacred science were using remnants of Atlantean high technology. And so the knowledge of the energy points on the globe and the ley lines, or the ley lines, and where they are, and how buildings are found, and gateways and things of this nature allow for passage along ley lines. Out in the country, for instance, you'll see just a gateway in the middle of kind of nowhere, and there's a ley line going straight through it. So again, sacred sites built on certain points, and this is allegedly something that was born in Atlantis, as far as the ability and the understanding of these aspects of our planet, and the way in which we can construct in conjunction with, again, sacred science and a knowledge of divine things. This allegedly reached a high culmination in Atlantis, but then there was at one point allegedly a war between the factions called by Casey the sons of the one god versus the sons of Belial. And so there was this opposing force, if you will, this contrasting climactic finale, where the final cataclysm took place and the final submerging took place, due to a great war playing out. And again, this is something that really gained more momentum through the theosophical recounting of the events of Atlantis. But it's still a very intriguing concept nonetheless. Whether we think about it, whether we think about this great landmass it being a very simple society, maybe akin to what we think of as ancient Greek society that we're familiar with, even if it reached that culmination of culture and civilization, that still is quite significant. And it's interesting, and I'll repeat this as well, that science seems to really want to shy away from any consideration of Atlantis in a real scientific sense. Much information has been given as to a potential location for Atlantis that takes it far from where Plato describes it in the Atlantic Ocean. There's ideas that Atlantis may have at one point in time been Antarctica may have been Atlantis, and there are many early maps that show it free of ice. And again, if we go back to the pole shift concept, that perhaps Atlantis did slide on over and became Antarctica. It's difficult to say with any real certainty, again, due to the extreme amounts of time that have lapsed since those events could have theoretically taken place. So the sliding over of Atlantis to become what we now know as Antarctica is possible, and more delving into that and finding what lies under the ice will lend to more understanding of that in the future. And again, with our X-ray technology and more of what we've been able to develop through our current scientific technology, should eventually lend to more discoveries along these lines, and more, again, continuing discoveries, not just there, but everywhere, that will hopefully help to paint and portray a fuller picture, a more clear, more detailed picture of what may have taken place back in these ancient times, and hopefully also seek to demonstrate the science that seemed to be in evidence and seemed to be shared to some degree in these ancient times. The artifacts that are left that give some indication, again, of some correspondences between cultures and some contemporary exchanges between these peoples of these times. Also the languages, common myths, ideas about the various flora and fauna, different migrations of different plants and animals that don't really have a great explanation due to the large, vast distances. How did this plant get from here to here, due to these circumstances? And that's an interesting aspect of it. And again, so many myths also tie in with this metaphysical concept And then lastly, in the metaphysical realm, there's a great book called A Dweller on Two Planets, and this was written around 1900 by a young man who was about 18 years of age at the time that he wrote it. And this is a channeled book, and which is, that's going to have its own intrigue. But it gives a very vivid portrayal and account of what took place during old Atlan, the old Poseidonus is another term for one of the land masses that made up what was known as Atlantis in that day. And so his recount is probably the most romantic, if you will, of the different accounts that have been given. And it actually does, recount and portray an individual who had an incarnation in Atlantis and loves lost and then recovered in further lifetimes, and how all this ties together. And that, again, further fuels the thread of the ancient people